the from what I'm seeing, really just on the surface here, Nathan Goffness is trying to leverage anti-Israel Jews as a way to debunk the cultural critique. Is that a fair assessment?
That is part of it because, as Kevin McDonald would say, support for the Jewish state is usually, a key aspect of support for Jewish interests.
Mm-hmm. Sure. No, that is definitely an interesting point. So you're saying that the fact that some Jews, like, for example, I will say this. All right, I will say that there are a couple of Jews that are legitimately anti-Zionist and legitimately principled. Max Blumenthal, for one.
Yeah.
The guy is not just anti-Zionist; he's a principled anti-war guy as well. And he was recently. I mean, would you consider the SPLC to be left-wing Jews?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the SPLC actually published an article by a literal Jewish Antifa named Alexander Reed Ross. This guy is a college professor who wrote a book about fighting the fascists in the 21st century, and he literally does lectures dressed up like Bruce Willis in the new Death Wish movie. All right, this guy is a criminal, a communist terrorist, and he was hired by the SPLC to write a hit piece on Max Blumenthal, claiming that he's a Russian agent because of the fact that he's a Zionist and he's anti-military intervention in Syria. So there's anti-Zionist Jews like Max Blumenthal who you can count on one hand, and that's only if you got a couple of fingers blown off from and then you got the liberal Jews, quote unquote, like the SPLC, who might condemn more extreme Kahanis and such for publicity reasons, PR reasons, but in the end, they do more policing. Like Alexander Reed Ross, the Antifa, he might be considered a Israel critic Jew, but why does he police anti-Zionists more than he does Zionists?
Right. Good question.
Because if you actually look at these anti-Israel Jews, the ones that are more milquetoast about their criticism of Israel, I mean, you don't ever see large, violent, Jewish-led demonstrations by people like Alexander Reed Ross at AIPAC. You see them instead at the Richard Spencer rally.
Right.
Really, Richard Spencer is actually a moderate compared to Benjamin Netanyahu. Richard Spencer doesn't want to racially exterminate people. Benjamin Netanyahu does. So the fact that the Antifas will go to a little college lecture in Michigan State University to shut it down, a college lecture where Spencer just wants to have a conversation about his German idealism and stuff like that, they'll go out of their way to use batons and spiked brass knuckles led by Jewish Antifas or supported by Jewish Antifas that are leftists. And yet, when it comes to AIPAC or in Manhattan, when they do an Israeli Defense Force fundraiser where they have $100,000 plate donations that go straight to buy bullets, guns, and airplanes so Israel can bomb Palestinian children, no militant resistance is ever seen around those events.
Okay, let me agree with you on one point and let me passionately disagree with you on one point there. So I passionately agree with you that it's a lot easier to rally against Richard Spencer than it is to rally against AIPAC, because AIPAC and Jewish events have unbelievable amounts of security. They're unbelievably tied into police forces, and it would be a suicide mission to go up against them, while it's easy to beat up on Richard Spencer. So I agree with that critique. I passionately disagree with you saying that Richard Spencer is much more moderate than Bibi Netanyahu. You said, I think, quoting you correctly, that you said that Bibi Netanyahu wants to racially exterminate people. Well, Israel has the Middle East's biggest, most powerful military. So Israel could exterminate anyone it wants to in the Middle East. Absolutely. Without a doubt, they could be dropping nuclear weapons. They could be dropping other weapons. They could kill millions of people without raising a sweat. It would be that easy because they have this overwhelmingly dominant military in the Middle East, and yet they haven't done that. You talk about Israel deliberately bombing Palestinian children. Well, how do you think Israel should respond when Palestinian terrorists send rockets into Israel? Of course, Israel is then going to bomb the area where those rockets come from, and those rockets usually come from a deliberately targeted placed by Palestinian terrorists in areas where they force women and children to stay around there so they can make Israel look bad when Israel defends itself. I'm done. Go ahead, Stryker.
Okay. So there's a couple of things there. First of all, you talk about the might of the Israeli military, and yes, they got, the Saudi military is also very mighty. It's very expensive. They got all the newest gadgets from the United States, just like in Israel. Well, the Israeli military invaded Lebanon in 2006 and lost to Hezbollah, guys that were fighting. The Israeli military's had this new tank. I don't have the name on hand, but it was this tank was supposed to steamroll all of their opposition and all their neighbors. And Hezbollah suddenly popped out with some Russian-made missiles and turned those tanks into rolling ovens. All right, those tanks were basically a casket, a rolling casket for the Israeli military. Another thing too is that whenever the IDF in the latest skirmishes they've had with Hamas, the kill to death ratio of the IDF has been getting worse over time. And it's not because they're holding back, because they have no problem cutting off water from Gaza, cutting off humanitarian supplies, bombing ambulances. They have no problem terrorizing the civilians. Where the Israeli military has a problem is in fighting the actual guerrillas there, the actual militants. And that's the first thing. Now, the second thing about racial extermination, if Israel were to start nuking its neighbors, this would obviously cause an international crisis. Now that the Russians are in the Middle East, the Russians are, to an extent, connected with Hezbollah. They're definitely supporting Iran. Iran has a lot of new technology thanks to the Russians, a lot of technology that I won't say equalizes them to Israel, but sans nuclear weapons, they can. The Sunburn 2 missile can sink aircraft carriers, which is the United States' military doctrine, which I assume would jump in if Israel was starting a war to exterminate its neighbors. America would jump in to help them. The Iranians have a lot of counters to the Israeli military, and this is a problem for not just Israel, but also America and other imperialist powers, is that today the fruits of Soviet military doctrine, which was to counter American doctrine, military doctrine, through cheaper means, defensive means, like the Sunburn missile, that has led to a scenario in the world right now where the little guys, the underdogs, the Hamas, the Hezbollahs, the Syrians, even the Iranians, who are pretty sophisticated in their own right, they actually can competently resist Israel and America, which is a big reason why America has sort of restrained itself from regime changes. I mean, America hasn't even been able to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, and it's almost 2 decades of war over there. So, just imagine a more sophisticated military like the Iranians, a large country, which I believe has a population of 80 million. It's fully industrialized. It's got a lot of investment in military, the latest in Russian technology. If Israel were to fight a direct war with Iran, I'm not so sure they would win without using their nukes. And if they use their nukes, they're going to cause an international incident where Israel itself will be nuked. So that would be my response to that. What do you think?
Okay, so the average Arab IQ is about 82. The average IQ in Iran is 84. That is 4 points lower than Mexicans. So I just don't see either Iran or any Arab country, whether they are Sunni or Shia, ever being a particularly formidable force. I mean, their countries are all, by and large, pathetic.
Okay, well, I would argue again, just like Mexico, Iran is a very racially mixed country. So while the average IQ may be somewhat low, I would argue that some of the Iranians working in the nuclear field, engineers, people like that, those people may be more disproportionately Indo-European or of that branch of the Persian history. And, you know, it would be more interesting to see what their IQ is like, because like we were talking about before, Luke, the culture builders and the vanguards of a civilization can possibly be dwindled down to 200,000 people. So the average IQ of the top 200,000, in my opinion, is more important than, or not more important. Of course, the average IQ in a nation in general is important in terms of measuring living standards, day-to-day life. But when it comes to geopolitics, I would argue that the Shia world is winning against Israel, and that's part of the reason why they're getting so desperate that they're, you know, jumping into bed with the Saudis and jumping into bed with the Gulf states, because the Shias are right on Israel's border. They're right at the Golan Heights now. They beat back ISIS. They got Hezbollah on the Golan Heights, near the Golan Heights. They got the Lebanese. The Lebanese are entrenched right now, despite all the espionage and intelligence service attacks on they took down the Lebanese prime minister and such. I would say that the Shias are stronger than ever in the region, and they're challenging Israel for geopolitical hegemony with some success. You wouldn't give them that much credit?
No, I think you make some good points there. Just incidentally, do you believe that there were like dancing Israelis on 9/11 who had knowledge of the attacks on the Twin Towers before they occurred?
That is a very complicated question, because I do think that the Israelis had some knowledge of 9/11. I'm not going to go as far as to say that they did it themselves, but the fact that the dancing Israelis are not just a conspiracy hoax, they're a real thing. I mean, there's people that saw them and filmed them, and the FBI detained them, and then they went back to Israel. And not just that, the FBI didn't just detain them. They found traces of explosives in their truck. They found the front group. There was like a moving company. You know, there's a lot of open threads with that we can only speculate about, really. But the dancing Israelis did exist, did they not?
I think so. I think everything you said is true. There's an interesting comment in the chat by Lux. I used to be pro-Palestinian, but after seeing what the Arabs did to Europe, I understand where the Israelis are coming from. Do you have any reaction to that?
No, I definitely see the problem is that the problem is that in Europe right now, right, it's very easy to conflate things, right? The Arabs there's two types of problems with Arabs in Europe. The first problem is terrorism, right? But the terrorism in Europe is not being done by, you know, it's not like in the 70s and 80s where you had the Irish Republican Army and the Palestinian Liberation Organization working together and stuff. No, the terrorism, the Muslim terrorism in Europe today is bred in radical mosques that are tolerated in Europe by the governments, because the Saudi Arabian government is financing these radical mosques, the Wahhabist mosques, and the Saudi Arabian government is able to get away with this in Europe because of their connections with Israel. The fact that the Saudis, remember, the Saudis are aligned with Israel now, which the Israeli government itself doesn't deny. And, Thomas Friedman, who I hate, the globalist Thomas Friedman, the New York Times, he's constantly praising the Saudi regime. And this is the country that is exporting the radical terrorist ideology. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Arabs in Europe tend to be disproportionately migrants from a criminal element of places like Pakistan. And these people are flooded into Europe. They're not particularly religious. They're just scumbags. And yeah, they got low IQs and criminal elements. And you start to understand why Muhammad created Islam, where criminals get their hands chopped off and you got to cover women up so they don't get raped. I mean, this is the logic behind Islam. So ironically, the problem in Europe with Arabs is that either they're not Muslim enough, or they're so Muslim of the Saudi branch of Islam, the Sunni Wahhabist extremist branch that is sponsored or tolerated by Western governments, and especially tolerated by Israel, because they see Wahhabi Sunni terrorist Islam as a counter to the more sophisticated and enlightened Iranian, Lebanese, and Shia form of Islam. What do you think?
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. Question in the chat, they're asking, what is Stryker's racial background?
I'm not going to go too into depth, but I'm mostly of Southern European descent.
Okay. And would you like to see the extermination of every Jew on earth?
No, definitely not. I don't want that. I mean, I'm not into that kind of stuff. I don't find it to be necessary. The way I would solve the Jewish question is I would just deport all Jews to whatever, Israel or whatever, and then flood the country with African immigrants so that they can fly off the cliff they were trying to throw us off.
And so you would like to see the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel?
That's a pretty loaded question. What do you mean destruction? I don't want
to like to see Israel cease to be a functioning Jewish state.
Well, notice that. I mean, what I would want is for Israel to learn to go into a multicultural phase and learn to coexist with other people so that they can be enriched by the lovely different kinds of foods, and they can have a beautiful caramel colored children and things like that. That's what I want. I don't want to destroy them. I want them to enjoy the great benefits that they've given to us in the West.
Do you see Israel as a model for anything positive for white people?
No, because I don't think that meddling in, I don't think becoming a rogue state and the center of 90% of geopolitical problems and wars in the world right now is a good model for a future white ethno state. And I also don't believe that meddling in every single other country other than our own in order to force them to become liberal, multicultural, deracinated, individual, liberal cesspools that we can parasite off is a long-term strategy that is compatible with the Western civilization and the Aryan soul. I don't think so. No.
I believe last Sunday you said that Jews were responsible for 99% of the problems in the United States. How about Europe? What percentage of the problems in Europe would you attribute to Jews?
Well, I mean, it really I mean, that's a very wide question. I could fill a library with the stuff that I could say. I mean, you could go into, let's say, the philosophy that dominated after the Second World War. You know, the idea that Europeans went without a fight. What about World War II? Right? Tens of millions of Europeans of all types, Western people, Aryan people of all types, they follow the Germans and Italians to defeat international capitalism and international communism. So, you know, millions of people died to prevent the world we're in right now. Now, would you say the Jewish people were one of the big winners in World War II in terms of what came after, in terms of the power they achieved afterwards?
Yes.
So my point is that whatever you got to say about the internal politics of Europe, everyone can admit that Europe is under the thumb of the Anglo-Saxon powers, say America and Britain. And these countries are beyond reasonable doubt. Even if Lithuania doesn't have a large Jewish population, Lithuania is in NATO, and thus it's an occupied country. It's a satellite state. It has the same relationship with the United States that Czechoslovakia had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. No one would argue or dispute that Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia were client states of the Soviet Union and thus had to answer to Soviets, and they had to integrate Soviet culture into their countries. So why do people dispute that when it comes to Europe? The average European, the average Swede, since we were talking about Sweden before, the average Swede, if you go to Sweden, 90% of their television is garbage that is created by Jews in America and then exported to Sweden, to the point where, you know, basically all Swedes speak English. They don't even have subtitles in their movies or shows there. They just take stuff from America, the worst Jewish trash, social engineering media from America, and Europeans all consume it and become Americanized. And when you become Americanized, you become Judaized. That's my point.